Some people don't chase validation online not because they're more disciplined, more evolved, or less emotional than others, but because their inner sense of self doesn't reach outward in that direction very often. It's not restraint, it's not superiority, it's not even a choice most of the time. The pull simply isn't strong. For them, approval doesn't function as fuel, so there's no ongoing effort to collect it. This isn't something they're doing against the culture. It's something that never fully took hold in them to begin with. And when that's the case, the absence of visible engagement isn't a gap that needs to be filled. It's just empty space that never felt demanding. This often gets misread. Low visibility is interpreted as indifference, insecurity, or quiet judgment. But internally, it usually feels far more neutral than that. There isn't a sense of withholding. There isn't an internal debate about whether to post, reply, or stay silent. Nervous system doesn't brace around those decisions. The self doesn't feel like it's on the line. When validation isn't central to how you locate yourself, you don't experience its absence as loss. You experience it as quiet. And quiet, when you're used to it, doesn't feel like deprivation. It feels like normal ground. You can often see this pattern in small, unremarkable behaviors. You might open an app, scroll for a minute, and close it without finishing the feed. You might share something once and never look back to see how it was received. Messages don't create urgency in your body. You don't rehearse responses before posting, or feel compelled to clarify yourself afterward. Sometimes you forget what you posted entirely. When something gets little response, it doesn't land as embarrassment. When something gets attention, it doesn't reorganize your mood. There's no spike, no crash, just a continuation of the day you were already in. These moments are easy to overlook because they don't feel like decisions, they feel like defaults. You may also notice that you rarely feel the impulse to document things as they're happening. Experiences don't feel incomplete without an audience. You don't feel pressure to mark moments as meaningful in real time. When something matters, it settles privately first. If it ever gets shared, it's often later, when the moment has already passed through you and lost its urgency. This delay isn't avoidance, it's sequencing. Meaning forms internally before it's ever externalized, if it's externalized at all. Psychologically, this often points to a self-concept that developed with fewer immediate mirrors. When identity forms in environments where feedback is slower, inconsistent, or understated, the internal system learns to stabilize without constant reinforcement. You come to recognize yourself through repetition rather than response. Interests stay alive without applause. Preferences don't need confirmation to feel valid. You learn what fits by living with it, not by watching how it's received. Over time, this builds an internal reference point that doesn't recalibrate every time attention shifts. So when digital platforms offer rapid affirmation or silence, neither one carries much authority. They arrive, but they don't reorganize you. This kind of self-concept tends to be quieter, but also heavier. It has weight because it's been carried internally for a long time. And when that's the case, the constant visibility demanded by online spaces can start to feel oddly intrusive. Not threatening, just unnecessary. Each post, each update, each performance of coherence asks you to flatten something continuous into something momentary. Even when it's honest, it's still a reduction. Over time, you may start to feel tired of introducing yourself in pieces, tired of compressing your inner life into something legible, comparable, and quickly consumed. This is where identity fatigue begins, though it rarely announces itself that way. It doesn't feel like burnout or rejection. It feels like a subtle resistance to roles you never consciously agreed to carry. The role of the available person, the responsive person, the person who signals presence through output. You may notice that maintaining these roles takes more energy than they return. Not because you dislike connection, but because the form of connection being offered doesn't match how you experience yourself. The exhaustion comes from translation, not from interaction itself. What makes this especially quiet is that nothing feels broken. You're not failing at visibility. You're not excluded. You could participate more if you wanted to. But participation begins to feel like maintenance work rather than expression. And when identity already feels intact, maintenance starts to feel like erosion. Not dramatic erosion, slow erosion. The kind that happens when you keep shaving off edges to fit a space that was never designed to hold depth for very long. That's where these first layers settle, not in withdrawal, not in superiority, not in detachment, but in a stable self that doesn't require frequent external confirmation to remain coherent. There's often an internal tension that forms quietly here, even when nothing feels obviously wrong. On one side, there's relief. Not having to perform, respond, or stay visible creates space in the body. The nervous system settles. There's less noise, less comparison, fewer subtle evaluations happening in the background. On the other side, there's a softer pull that doesn't always have language. A desire to be known without having to announce yourself, to be felt without having to maintain presence. These two truths can exist at the same time without cancelling each other out. You can feel protected by distance and still feel a faint longing for resonance. Neither one invalidates the other. They simply coexist, unresolved. This is where the experience becomes more complex than it looks from the outside. You're not torn between connection and isolation in an obvious way. You're navigating between safety and reach. Safety lives in not being scrutinized, not being measured, not having your inner life reduced to metrics. Reach lives in the quiet wish that someone might understand you without needing constant access. The tension isn't dramatic. It doesn't demand resolution. It just hums in the background. And because it isn't painful enough to force action, it often goes unacknowledged, even by you. After stepping back, many people notice a particular kind of relief first. The absence of expectation feels spacious. There's no pressure to keep up, no sense of falling behind, no subtle guilt for not being present enough. Time stretches differently. Attention returns inward. But alongside that relief, there's often a moment of disorientation. Silence has texture, without the low-level feedback loop of reactions and responses. You may notice gaps where external affirmation used to quietly sit, even if you never relied on it consciously. The day feels calmer, but also less punctuated. You're less interrupted, but also less mirrored. Often, there's a moment when you realize that fewer people are aware of what's happening in your life. Not because they don't care, but because you haven't made it visible. This realization doesn't necessarily hurt. It just lands. It can feel neutral, slightly strange, sometimes even grounding. And sometimes there's a brief flicker of something else. Not regret, but awareness. Awareness of how connection now requires more intention, more specificity, more mutual presence. Silence becomes both shelter and absence, depending on the moment you encounter it. Within this quiet, a certain kind of grief can surface. Not loud, not dramatic, and not aimed at anyone. It's the grief of what almost worked, relationships that felt close in one context but couldn't survive without constant visibility. Versions of yourself that were easier to recognize when they were being reflected back to you. Moments of shared attention that didn't deepen into shared understanding. This grief isn't about loss in the traditional sense. It's about near alignment, about connections that functioned under certain conditions, but couldn't adapt when those conditions changed. There may also be grief for versions of yourself that once felt more easily accessible to others, not because those versions were false, but because they were simpler to receive. You don't miss them because they were better. You miss them because they were legible. Letting go of that legibility can feel like letting go of being easily known. And even when you don't want to return to it, you may still feel a tenderness toward what it offered. This kind of grief doesn't ask for reversal. It just asks to be acknowledged without judgment. As time goes on, another layer becomes visible if you look closely. Patterns that began as protection can slowly harden. What once felt like a natural boundary can turn into a default position. Not sharing becomes easier than choosing when to share. Silence becomes familiar enough that it starts to feel like identity rather than circumstance. This doesn't mean something has gone wrong. It means adaptation is still happening. But it's worth noticing the difference between rest and retreat, even when the line between them is subtle. Often the signal isn't loneliness or dissatisfaction, it's narrowing. Fewer points of contact, fewer places where parts of you are reflected at all. This narrowing can feel clean and controlled, which is why it's easy to miss. There's no crisis pushing you to examine it, just a gradual solidifying of patterns that once felt flexible. Awareness here doesn't require urgency. It doesn't demand change. It simply invites you to notice whether protection is still serving you in the same way it once did, or whether it has quietly become the only option you're allowing yourself. You're allowed to exist without translating yourself for constant visibility. You're allowed to let parts of your life remain unannounced, unfinished, and unmeasured. It's okay if connection doesn't come from exposure, and it's okay if your sense of reality doesn't sharpen when it's reflected back at you. You don't have to perform continuity to deserve it. You don't have to keep a presence active in order to remain real, and you don't have to decide whether your distance means something about you. Sometimes it's just the shape your nervous system takes when it's not being asked to brace. It's also okay if your relationship with being seen is selective and uneven. You don't have to be fully accessible to be sincere. You don't have to disappear in order to stay intact. You're allowed to let certain spaces pass through you, lightly, without attaching identity to participation or absence. If something inside you stays quieter online, that doesn't mean it's shrinking. It may simply be conserving itself for places where reflection feels slower, safer, or more precise. You're not obligated to turn inward experiences outward just to confirm they happened. Strength, in this context, doesn't look like total withdrawal or constant openness. It looks like discernment, knowing which connections deepen you and which ones flatten you, allowing partial presence without self-judgment, letting some relationships be ambient, some intentional, and some internal. Connection doesn't have to be continuous to be meaningful. It doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes it lives in infrequent exchanges, shared understanding without updates, or simply in knowing who you'd reach for if you needed to. Selectivity isn't avoidance when it's grounded in self-knowledge. It's alignment. So when you notice that you don't chase validation online, you don't need to frame it as a virtue or a loss. It can simply be a reflection of where your sense of self already lives. You're not opting out of connection. You're relating on terms that don't require constant proof. And if that feels quiet, that quiet doesn't mean you're alone in it. It means you're standing on something internal that doesn't disappear when no one is looking.